I want to talk today about Hungary in 1956, and I have a curious feeling of deja vu when I talk about Hungary in 1956, because yesterday, in the city of Tirana in Albania, the 40-foot bronze statue of Enver Hoxha was pulled to the ground by a huge crowd. Can you settle down, folks? Just pass these quietly without shouting at each other. And 35 years ago, in Hungary, very similar events occurred on a rather grander scale, and that's what I want to talk about today, the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. Now, everybody knows something about the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. It began on Tuesday, the 23rd of October, 3 days after Khrushchev left Poland in the events which I described last time. A new government, there was an uprising in Hungary beginning on the 23rd of October. A new government was created under a man called Imre Nagy. And as everybody also probably knows, on the 4th of November, or the night of the 3rd of November, the Russian army invaded Hungary and put down the uprising. Imre Nagy was arrested and was 2 years later executed. As a result of the Russian invasion, a new government was put in place under a man called János Kadar, K-A-D-A-R. And probably people also know, or they need to know, that all of this happened at the same time that the British and the French and the Israelis were engaged in a military operation against Egypt over the question of the Suez Canal. This international context needs to be borne in mind. Now, that's what everybody knows. Let's talk a little bit more about this. So firstly, let's note there are several interpretations of these events in Hungary in 1956. The first interpretation we can note is that given by Moscow and echoed by a large part of the Western Communist parties. This said that what happened in Hungary was an attempt at a fascist coup or an imperialist adventure or an attempt by Horthyite reactionaries. Horthy was the head of the military government in Hungary before the war, and Western agents. A right-wing event, in other words, an attempt to subvert communism by the right. Now, the difficulties with that interpretation are firstly that it assumes there was socialism in Hungary in the first place. There was something left-wing to be overthrown. Secondly, it condemns socialism in Hungary anyway, because what is quite clear is there was a mass uprising by the Hungarian people against this system. And in any case, it's contradicted by various kinds of evidence, apart from if you like, from within the ranks of official communism. Firstly, the Daily Worker, which was the Communist Party paper at the time, had a correspondent in Hungary at the time called Peter Fryer. And he wrote reports from Hungary and afterwards wrote a book about the events, but his reports were entirely favourable to the revolution and so on and so on. The Daily Worker wouldn't print them. The Polish and the Yugoslav Communist Party press reported that this was a popular uprising and so on and so on, and said that this was the most important feature of the thing, that it was a popular and indeed working class uprising. And interestingly, János Kadar himself, on the 3rd of November, on the 1st of November, before he left Hungary to link up with the Russians, the man who himself was to become the head of the party after the putting down of the uprising, he himself made a speech on the 1st of November in which he talked about how this had been an entirely proper uprising and it was creating a new and revived socialism in Hungary, and he welcomed the revolution. Now, that's one kind of interpretation. There's a second kind of interpretation which you might call the dominant Western interpretation, which has got two elements in it. One element is the emphasis on the Hungarian Revolution as a struggle for freedom, which sees it on the whole as being a pro-Western event, and it's an interpretation which completely ignores the social content of the Hungarian Revolution, about which I'll say some more in a moment. That it was much more than simply a demand for freedom that was put people who were involved in the Hungarian Revolution. And secondly, there was a tendency very strong in the Western interpretation to treat the intellectuals as the key actors, as it were, the key producers of ideas, the key producers of the events, and so on. And this particularly, the Western interpretation ignored the important role played by industrial workers and the social and political content which they gave to the Hungarian Revolution, particularly in the period after the return of the Russians. It also ignores the relative moderation of the intelligentsia in the revolution, that in fact they were by no means the most active forces in the revolution. Now, there's a third view, which is the one which I'm going to put forward today, which in my view is more correct, which is that the Hungarian Revolution was a classic social revolution. And it's important in a number of respects, but two in particular I want to mention. Firstly, what happened in Hungary in 1956 gave the lie, absolutely, to those Western theories of the Eastern European countries which said that these were totalitarian societies. Because the word totalitarian in Western political science didn't merely mean centralized political power and prevention by police methods and so on of political opposition. It actually drew on the imagery of books like George Orwell's 1984 and presented the population of these countries as utterly cowed, utterly submissive, utterly brainwashed, as it were, quite unable to fight back. If you read George Orwell's 1984, it's an extraordinarily miserable book. It says the future lies with the proles at the end of the book, but actually if you read the book, there's no possibility that those proles could do anything. None of them even remembered anything. They've all had their memories wiped, as it were, like as if they were computer disks or something, rather than being people, capable of organising themselves, capable of revolting, capable of expressing their own wants. There's no sense in the imagery of totalitarianism, of the language of the theory of totalitarianism, as it was popular in Western accounts of communist societies, but there being possibilities of cracks and fissures and contradictions and tensions within the system and so on and so on. But I think secondly, and much more importantly, the Hungarian Revolution revived a tradition of working class revolution. A tradition which had been celebrated by Marx in 1871 in his account of the Paris Commune, and which was celebrated in 1917 by the Bolsheviks, particularly Lenin, in their account of the Russian Revolution. What I hope to show is that the working people of Hungary attempted to, in the process of the Hungarian Revolution, to create a new kind of state power, which would be founded in grassroots democratic organizations, in grassroots democratic institutions, above all, bodies which they called workers' councils. And it's this which, for me, makes the Hungarian Revolution one of the great classic social revolutions, one of the great workers' revolutions of history. In fact, we can say, using properly the language of 1917, it was a Soviet revolution, because Soviet was merely another word for was the Russian word for workers' council. Now, what's the background to the events of 1956? The Hungarian regime was a regime with very little popular legitimacy. It was an extreme Stalinist regime. Rakosi, the head of the government, was described by his own party in his own party press as being Stalin's best pupil in Europe. It was a country in which, like the other countries of Eastern Europe, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, crash industrialization was pursued as a policy by a highly centralized state, and this produced economic crisis and poverty for a great mass of the Hungarian population. Now, in July 1953, remember I talked last time about the impact of Stalin's death. 10 days after the uprising in East Berlin, in July 1953, a man whose first name I've forgotten, Mikoyan, from the Kremlin, a leading Communist Party leader from Russia, told the Hungarian party they had got to change their ways. Rákosi, the leader of the party, was until that time also the Prime Minister of Hungary. And he was removed as Prime Minister, although he remained as the General Secretary of the party. And a man called Imre Nagy, who had been pushed out of the centre of power in the period of crash industrialisation, was brought back to be the Prime Minister. This is in 1953. And his job was to, in a sense, he was given the job of reforming Hungarian society. And as part of that, he revealed he gave out important information simply about the critical condition of the Hungarian economy, the tremendous shortages of raw materials that actually existed in Hungarian industry, the very low quality of the production in Hungarian industry, the fact that there was a massive balance of payments crisis in Hungary, the fact that agriculture was actually at a standstill, that it wasn't growing at all, and that therefore there were massive food shortages and so on, that Hungary was accumulating large debts because of its balance of payments problems, that living standards had been falling, and so on. He told some truths about the real situation of the Hungarian economy. And he also described the alienation of the population from the regime. He gave us one illustration of this, the fact that most of the people in Hungary's prisons were in fact industrial workers. Now, Nagy, if we want to characterize him, there's no question that he was a loyal party member. He was in fact a loyal Stalinist. He had been a loyal supporter of Stalin. But his argument essentially was that in order to pursue the goals which were agreed within the party, namely rapid industrialization and so on and so on, it was necessary to change methods. It was necessary to cut back the level of investment to a degree and accumulation in the economy, to slow the economy down to a degree. It was necessary to give the peasants some more freedom. And one of the things which Nagy introduced was the right of peasants to lead collective farms. He cut the amount of overtime and Sunday working in industry. And he released large numbers of people from Hungarian prisons, people who had been arrested in the period of high Stalinism, as it were, including, interestingly, one of the people that was released was a man who'd been in prison and been tortured by the secret police, a man called János Kadar, who was in 1956 to become the new leader of the party. He introduced what was called the new course in Hungarian policy. Now, in other words, what Nagy's becoming Prime Minister involved necessarily open criticism of the past practices and policies of the party and the state, but within a framework where the main apparatus, for example, of the party and the state remained there. Most of the same people remained in the same position. Rákosi was still the General Secretary of the party, although Imre Nagy was the Prime Minister. And the people who were still in office, who had held office in the period of Stalin and so on, didn't like the criticism, and they obstructed the reforms in various kinds of ways. The whole pattern of politics in Hungary was still in important senses dependent on what happened in the Kremlin. The reason that the Kremlin intervened in Hungary to change the personnel of government was because of their alarm at what had happened in Pilsen in Czechoslovakia and then in East Berlin in East Germany. And there was a struggle going on, as I mentioned last time, inside the Kremlin about what should be the way forward for Russia. When the Kremlin shifted and Khrushchev came to dominance in the Russian party, and Mikoyan, who had been associated with the idea of more reforms than Khrushchev wanted to pursue, Mikoyan was deposed and sent off to run a power station. Nagy also suddenly found himself removed again. In 1955 he was removed as Prime Minister and in fact expelled from the party for revisionism. However, what this really meant was that unlike the period of the early 1950s, where politics seemed to be completely monolithic, where there was one line, one party, no dissent at all, now it's quite clear that at the top of the party, at the top of the state, there are major splits and arguments amongst the leaders. And the arguments in ruling circles in Hungary created an opening, and a space, if you like, for public debate and for criticism of the system by various kinds of intellectuals and journalists. And the fact that Nagy was removed in 1955 from the Prime Ministership did not end with criticism in lower down in society. And the problem was for Rakosi, as the General Secretary of the party, you might say he'd won against Nagy, he'd restored the old system, and so on. Unfortunately for him, just a few days after Nagy was removed, Khrushchev opened his arms to Tito and began to repair the breach between Russia and Tito. He suddenly declared that Tito wasn't a fascist. His comrade Tito, big bear hug in front of the newspaper camera, in front of the film cameras, Tito, etc., etc. And there's a difficulty for Rakosi in this situation. He had been the hardest critic of all of Tito. He was the one who published most articles about how Tito was a fascist, an agent of the American imperialists, etc., etc. Suddenly Tito is declared to be innocent of all these crimes. Well, if Tito was innocent, what about a man called Laszlo Guy, who had been the General Secretary of the Hungarian Communist Party and who'd been murdered in 1949 as an agent of Tito's? What was the history of the Communist Party of Hungary? Suddenly the question is asked again in a new context. The crimes of the past are suddenly declared not to be crimes. Those who have been condemned in the past are suddenly declared, or potentially declared, to be innocent. Mrs. Reich, the wife of Laszlo Reich, was released from prison, and she began to campaign for the rehabilitation of her husband, killed in 1949. And the fall of Nagy, therefore, didn't still criticism inside Hungary. Then comes the beginning of 1956, and Khrushchev makes his secret speech, and I talked about its impact in Poland. In Hungary, one eyewitness, a woman called Dora Scarlett, who was a British member of the Communist Party working in Hungary, who wrote a very interesting memoir of the period, she described how there was panic in the Hungarian party over Khrushchev's secret speech. The party meetings stopped being held because the questions were too difficult to discuss. And a group called the Petofi Circle, P-E-T-O-F-I Circle, the Petofi Circle, a circle of intellectuals, mostly in the Communist Party at this time, began meeting from March 1956. Initially their meetings were fairly innocuous, but gradually they became increasingly popular and increasingly critical meetings. Reich's widow, Laszlo Reich's widow, spoke at the Petofi Circle, and a resolution was carried with acclaim calling for the rehabilitation of Laszlo Reich, which meant, of course, criticism of his chief prosecutor, the now General Secretary of the party, Rakosi, calling for the readmission of Imre Nagy to the party. Rakosi's response to this was to close down the Petofi Circle. Finally, in July, well, not finally yet, but in July of 1956, the Russian party intervened again, and Rakosi was in fact replaced as General Secretary by another loyal Stalinist, a man called Gero, anyway, G-E-R-O is his surname. Gero becomes the new General Secretary of the party. By now, the party, the whole ruling layer in Hungarian society, is seriously split and fragmented in all sorts of different directions. There are reports appearing in the press of increasing levels of discontent on the shop floor in Hungarian industry. The events in Poland are happening in this period. They're reported to a degree in the Hungarian media. They encourage further dissent in Hungary. And they inspire dissent in Hungary. The sales of journals the journalists, as in Poland, as I talked about last time, so in Hungary, the journalists, the newspapers and particularly magazines start to get more interesting. They start to publish material critical of the regime. Suddenly there's sales rise. There are accounts of people fighting in the streets to get hold of newspapers, which is always a sign of increasing interest in the population when people are fighting for newspapers. In October, the whole tempo of events speeded up. On the 6th of October, finally the government agreed that the remains of Laszlo Rajk could be reburied with honour. In other words, he's been rehabilitated, and his remains are taken from a prison cemetery and reburied in an important place in the state cemetery. 200,000 people came out for the ceremony to rebury Laszlo Rajk. Anti-speeches against the regime were made at his funeral, and a group of students, on a quite impromptu basis, a few hundred students, organised an impromptu march through the streets of Hungary calling for the restoration of Imre Nagy to the party, for the removal of Gera. The Petoki Circle started meeting again, and the example of the Petoki Circle was taken up in a number of provincial towns where meetings of poets and journalists and writers and so on also began to occur. On the 14th of October, Imre Nagy was readmitted to the party. And there was now a ferment of debate and argument in Hungarian society. And in this framework, a new student organisation developed. And this new student organisation decided to call a demonstration on the 23rd of October in solidarity with the Poles. The Poles, after all, had just had the events I talked about last time. They'd just won their victory, in a sense, the previous weekend against Moscow. They'd won their independence, their right to choose their own general secretary, and so on and so on and so on. Now, that was the purpose of the student demonstration, as it was originally called, was to express solidarity with the Poles. That was its purpose, no more and no less. But Gero, the General Secretary, banned the demonstration. The students responded to this by sending delegations to the factories in Budapest, asking for workers' support for the idea of the demonstration. And then the government unbanned the demonstration again and said it could go ahead. The effect of this government activity, first banning the demonstration and then permitting it, was that firstly it publicised the demonstration. It also angered people. And it revealed the weaknesses of the regime. Now the demonstration began in the early afternoon, sort of classic time for official demonstrations are usually called noon, 1 o'clock, something like that. Meet at All Saints, 1:30, march around town. That's a standard sort of thing. Well, this is the same, similar sort of thing. Student demonstration, a large and peaceful march of perhaps 100,000 people. In the later part of the afternoon, the demonstration was swelled by new numbers. As the factories closed for the day, large numbers of industrial workers came on the demonstration as well. And as the demonstration wore on and as it grew larger, the slogans became more and more radical. Finally, in the evening, there was a huge crowd, hundreds of thousands of people outside the Parliament building in Budapest, demanding that Imre Nagy, who had not up to this time played any part whatever in these events, should speak to them. Nagy finally turned up to an increasingly impatient crowd and spoke. And his first word was "comrades," and people shouted back to him, "We're not your comrades." And his whole speech was regarded as deeply disappointing. He basically didn't have anything to say to the crowd other than what Neil Kinnock might say to an anti-war demonstration today, get back to work. He was heckled and whistled by the crowd. Meanwhile, on the radio, Ernst Gero, General Secretary of the party, attacked the demonstrators. And people heard this. heard that this attack on them had occurred on the demonstration. And the march at this point, this demonstration, divided into two parts. One part went to the huge statue of Stalin, which was there in the middle of Budapest, and attacked it. And people tried to pull it down, and they were unable to pull it down simply with ropes and so on. It was made of, I don't know, a metal statue anyway. And in the end, workers from a nearby factory came with oxyacetylene equipment and cut it off at the knees. And finally it crashed to the ground, and all that remained were the Stalin's boots. There's this great famous photograph of Stalin's boots standing without anything above them. And the thing was pulled to the ground. The other half of the march went to the radio station in Budapest to protest about Gero's broadcast. When they got to the radio station, they found that members of the political police, the AVH, were defending it. There was a scurry, there was a skirmish between the AVH and this crowd, and the AVH fired into the crowd with their guns. And this was really the moment which settled the question of what was going to happen in Hungary. Because in response to that, the demonstration turned into an insurrection. It's rather like, if you like, the moment when in 1905 the crowd marched to see the Tsar, carrying icons, going to see the little father present their petitions, and the Tsarist army were ordered to fire on them. Nobody probably gave the order to the AVH men to fire. Nobody very high up, they were there and they fired in a panic, but it was enough to start an insurrection. And as night wore on, fighting spread all over Budapest, the night of the 23rd of October. And really the next 9 days in Hungary, the next 9 days after the 23rd of October, show a process through which the Hungarian insurrection develops and spreads and deepens as a revolution. And it follows, it follows the pattern of other classic revolutions. I'll just go through the events of those 9 days. On the 24th of October, the workers organised a general strike in Budapest. It's announced that Imre Nagy is once again the Prime Minister. Gero is still there as the General Secretary. Imre Nagy is restored to the Prime Ministership. The fighting in Budapest spreads to other towns in Hungary. On the 25th of October, Russian troops are fraternizing with Hungarian people outside the parliamentary building. When a firing occurs, people shoot up the crowd, probably the AVH, nobody can be sure who it was, from the rooftops around the parliament area. Russian troops fight back, shoot back. The tanks, there develops a pattern of fighting between the population of Budapest and the Russian tanks and the AVH, which is very confused and confusing. Ernst Gero is replaced as the General Secretary of the party. One day there's an attempt at a political settlement with Nagy as Prime Minister and Gero as the General Secretary. The next day there's a new arrangement, Nagy as the Prime Minister, Kadar as the General Secretary of the party. There are promises from the new government of reforms. The 26th of October, the general strike has become an all-Hungarian affair. All over Hungary, new kinds of popular committees are being established, revolutionary committees, workers' councils, and so on. And Peter Fryer, in his interesting memoir, makes an explicit comparison between these as he witnessed their development and the Soviets of the Russian Revolution. The beginnings of an alternative state power are appearing in the process of the Hungarian Revolution. At the major barracks in Budapest, the Kilian barracks, one of the colonels of the Hungarian army, a man called Paul Maleta, leads a section of the army to join the revolution. And it is immediately acclaimed and becomes enormously popular with the crowds and so on. Our Paul Maleta, Paul presumably doesn't have the same meaning as in English, but Comrade Pal, our friend Pal, etc. The military hero who's led a section of the army over to join the insurrection. On the 27th of October, a new government under Nagy is announced. Fighting is still continuing all across Hungary, and the government basically has to make a choice about what it's going to do about a country that's in revolt. One thing it's a choice. It can attempt to repress the revolt, or it can try to head the movement of revolt and try to contain it and control it by coming to its head. And the Nagy government chooses the latter option, chooses to put itself at the leadership of the popular movement in order to contain it. On the 28th of October, it is promised by the government that the Russian troops and the AVH will be withdrawn. On the 29th of October, Russian troops start withdrawing from the city. On the 29th of October, Russian troops start withdrawing from the city. On the 30th of October, the Communist Party headquarters in Budapest are besieged by a large crowd, and another of the famous scenes from, if you like, the picture book of the Hungarian Revolution. A number of secret policemen are killed in the street in rather unpleasant circumstances. A new government is announced, which is to be a coalition of democratic parties. The new parties are to be permitted, new parties are to form, and the government is to be a government which will be a coalition of democratic parties, which means that the Social Democrats are now going to revive, the National Peasant Party and the Smallholders parties. All of these will revive, and their initial leaderships are announced, and they're going to participate in the government this year. Last, coming towards the end of my 9 days of the Hungarian Revolution, on the 31st of October, at the Killian barracks, a meeting is held to form a new military organisation, a National Guard, to replace the old army and police. At the town of Győr, G-Y-O-R, it's the formation of a new regional political body called the Trans-Danubian National Council. This is formed. The USSR is not yet clarified its response to the events in Hungary. On the one hand, on the borders of Hungary, there are reports of troop movements. On the other hand, the Moscow radio speaks of an end to what it calls violations of the principles of legal equality between states. On the 1st of November, the Nagy government announces that it is withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact, and in future is going to join the camp of neutral countries. And Kadar makes the radio speech I mentioned before, in which he defends the revolution which has occurred and announces the formation of a new body called, somewhat ironically, the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party. No connection with anybody flying under the same flag today. Having made this speech, Kadar goes AWOL, as it were. He disappears from Hungary. Nobody knows where he is. He makes this speech and then disappears. Now, up to this point, what we have in Hungary, I think, are events like the early days of any classic social revolution. The old regime is overthrown by a massive popular insurrection. A new government emerges, which in practice has got very little control over what is happening. That government is basically retreating in the face of the popular movement. It lacks confidence, it lacks the capacity really to control society. Alongside this new government, we see the emergence of new popular institutions, revolutionary councils, workers' councils, a new popular militia, a National Guard. The whole of Hungary is characterized by, as the fighting declines, an atmosphere of festival. Lenin said about revolution, all revolutions are festivals of the oppressed and the exploited. You have this atmosphere of enormous gaiety and pleasure amongst the Hungarian population. At the same time, there is an enormous sense of popular unity in Hungary. All the different social forces have a sense of unity up to this point. The class differences and so on between different layers within the revolution have not yet come to the fore. The revolution seems to sweep all before it, all impediments away. And that sort of, you see that sort of picture, I don't know, you can look at the early days of the revolution in Portugal in 1974, you can look at the early days of the Russian Revolution in 1917, February 3 of the 1917 revolution. Any classic social revolution, in a sense, has got that sort of pattern. The early days of solidarity in Poland, the early days of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and so on. The early days of the Albanian Revolution of 1991, for that matter, I suspect. We don't have enough information about it yet. Certainly the pulling down of the statue is a repetition of 1956. What one would expect is that once that first phase was over, there would then be a long period of political struggle and clarification within the framework of the revolution. Because beneath the apparent unity of the Hungarian people, in practice, there are different social forces at work and with different kinds of aspirations. You see, firstly, there's the new March government. The March government's aim, quite clearly I think, is to try to ride the storm and to consolidate its rule. If you like, to do in Hungary what Gomulka had succeeded in doing in Poland, gradually to consolidate its rule and restore normality. And that would mean, of course, gradually removing popular institutions and so on. But that would take time. That was retain the existing form of society in a modified and reformed way, but essentially maintain the same pattern. Secondly, there's groups like the Pitofi Circle, intellectuals and so on. They are rather like the liberals and the leftists in Poland. They're not revolutionary. They call continually, throughout the period of the revolution, for restoration of peace and order in the streets and so on. They play the classic role of liberals. Thirdly, there are the workers' councils, which grow up in the actual period of the insurrection, within which within those workers' councils, there's an ongoing, extensive debate. They come out with statements very early on, saying they're absolutely opposed to the return of industrial property to private capitalists. We have not fought, they said, to give Hungarian industry to private capitalists. They aspire themselves to gain control of the factories, to run the factories under their own management, workers' self-management. But they have not yet developed, this is a matter of a few days, they have not by any means yet developed any clarity about the implications of such an aspiration. They're still new bodies, still finding their way, still sorting out who are leaders and who are followers amongst them. Who are the people they look to for ideas and who are the people whose ideas they want to reject and so on. It's another group which we might call, which is a rather difficult group to define, which we might call the street fighters. The people who do a good deal of the fighting in the street, who are a curious assortment of people. They include workers, large numbers of workers, they include some students, though they're predominantly not the students. They're much more mixed as a group. They don't come from any coherent social stratum. They are, in formal terms, more right-wing than some of the other social forces in Hungary. They have very little political clarity at all. And when the fighting dies down, and one or two of them attempt little adventures, like proposing themselves as leaders and so on, they find they have very little following. There's a story, for example, from Győr of a small unit of armed men turning up in a lorry and proclaiming themselves the new revolutionary government in Győr, and people telling them to get lost, and they basically disappear. And then there are the political parties, and the political parties are more middle class. What the leaders of the political parties are doing is not so much trying to organise themselves mass followings with clear programmes, they're jockeying for positions in the new government. They're not really mobilising for change. They're not very popular anyway. There isn't a tremendous enthusiasm. There's no evidence at all of mass enthusiasm for the new parties, people rushing to join the new parties, and so on. Most of the energies of the population are going into the new bodies like the workers' councils, the revolutionary councils, the popular militia, and so on. So what you have in Hungary at the beginning of November is a situation which revolutionaries have classically called one of dual power. On the one hand, you've got a new weak state which is officially in charge, but which in practice is not able to achieve very much. On the other side, you've got not entirely coherent, but very lively, enthusiastic and dynamic popular organisations, which in the long run would be likely to come into conflict with the government. And how that would be resolved would be a matter which would be determined over possibly some months. The whole process could have started, if you like, and one would expect it to develop further. One certainly couldn't say that by the 1st of November the outlines of a new political system in Hungary is beginning to be settled. However, the whole process of the revolution is then interrupted by a massive counter-revolutionary assault from Russia, because the Russian army is sent back into Hungary from the night of the 3rd of November. The next day, the 4th of November, Budapest wakes at dawn to the sound of gunfire. The bombardment of Budapest. Kadar reappears, having been absent for 2-3 days, as the head of a new stooge government. Imre Nagy flees to the Yugoslav embassy, goes into, takes refuge in the Yugoslav embassy. A few days later, he is tricked into leaving the Yugoslav embassy. He's arrested, taken away to Romania, and in 1958 he and Palmer later and 2 others were executed. But the Russians invaded Hungary with 3,000 tanks and 200,000 troops. The pattern of fighting was not that there was hand-to-hand fighting between Russian soldiers and the Hungarian people. They fought as a resistance. They bombarded areas of opposition. They won by shelling the opposition. The fighting lasted for 5 days. And the worst casualties and the worst damage inflicted by gunfire and so on was in the working class districts of Budapest. The middle class districts were rather not very badly touched. And this is, if you like, the areas of greatest resistance were in the working class districts. At the end of the fighting, 24,500 people, Hungarian people were dead, and about 1,000 Russian troops had been killed. 400 to 450 people were arrested and executed, and Hungary then, there was an exodus of a large number of the Hungarian population. 200,000 people fled across the border from Hungary into Austria and elsewhere. 2% of the Hungarian population left as refugees in the succeeding weeks. By the 11th of November, it seemed that the revolution had been drowned on the streets in blood. Simply the overwhelming firepower of the Russian army determined the question of military victory. The revolution seemed to be drowned in blood. But, interestingly, this was not the end of the Hungarian Revolution, although it's often presented as if it was. This was not Chile in 1973, in which the military assault by the army finally crushed the revolution. Nor was it Poland in 1981, when the military action of Jaruzelski and the army ended solidarity for a period. Because the workers' movement in Hungary, the workers' movement is what I want to stress in the last part of what I want to say, was not demoralised. This wasn't a workers' movement which was now ground down by a long struggle in which it had failed to win victory, and so on and so on. This was a brand new workers' movement which was just rising in its revolutionary enthusiasm, and so on. It was at the peak of its new organisational strength and enthusiasm and the rest of it. And there's a new phase in the history of the Hungarian Revolution which was very little reported in the Western press, but which has been written about in a number of important articles and books in the period since. You see, you had a situation in which the state controlled the streets. There's no question. Militarily, the Russian army had won, and they controlled the streets, but they didn't control the factories. And there now developed a second phase of dual power, in which the state controlled the apparatus of government and the streets, but they couldn't get production started. And the reason they couldn't get production started was because of the workers' councils. The Russian invasion led to a restarting of the general strike across the whole of Hungary. The following ironic satirical slogan appeared on the walls of the engineering plant at Sheffield, which is one of the biggest engineering plants in Hungary. Quote, before the 40,000 aristocrats and fascists of the Sheffield works strike on. The Russians were saying this was a revolution of aristocrats and fascists, to which the workers replied, we, the aristocrats and fascists, all 40,000 of us, continue our strike. There's a new growth and a new development in this situation of the workers' councils, which involves a new growth and new development of working class consciousness and working class politics in the latter part of November and on into December of 1956. And again, I can run through the events, and there's some documentation of this in the stuff that was given you as handouts. On the 11th of November, that's more or less the day that the fighting the fate of the fighting is settled. In the 11th district of Budapest, a district workers' council is created. This is a body which is not simply a factory body, but a body linking together factories in that district of Budapest. The next day, another district workers' council is set up in an area of Budapest called Újpest. And this calls the district workers' council of Újpest, which is spelled U-J-P-E-S-T. You can get the details anyway from these accounts in the articles and so on. The district workers' council of Budapest calls for a central workers' council of Greater Budapest. In other words, that there should be a body set up for the whole of Budapest, and in principle for the whole of Hungary, which will be a meeting place for all the workers' councils of all the factories. And the demand which they put forward from Újpest is for an independent Hungary based not on parliamentary democracy, but on the direct democracy of workers' and peasants' councils. A radical grassroots democracy is the vision which they put forward. On the 13th of November, 2 days later, the first attempt was made to hold a meeting of a central workers' council, as it had been called from the Újpest District Workers' Council. But the Russian army surrounded the building where the meeting was to take place, and it couldn't occur until the next day. Meanwhile, the delegates from the Újpest District Council went to negotiate with Kadar, the new head of the government. And interestingly, he allowed them to negotiate with him in the sense that he was willing to meet them, because the government was in a fix. The whole of Budapest was on strike. So he met them, but brusquely refused to consider their demands. The next day, the 14th of November, the first meeting of the Greater Budapest Workers' Council occurred. They agreed on their demands, and they sent delegates again to meet Kadar, now from the Central Workers' Council, and this time Kadar was much more conciliatory, much more willing to talk to them, and so on. At the same time, the Workers' Councils faced a very serious dilemma, because they knew that they were militarily unable to beat the Russian army. And therefore they faced the problem, what on earth do we do? Do we carry on with the general strike? What do we achieve if we carry on with the general strike, and so on? Can we try somehow to force the government into some kind of compromise with us? And it's very well described in the article by Balázs Námec, which I've given you as a handout, because it's rather difficult to get hold of. Eventually they decided to call off the general strike. But then delegates who came from the provinces, from provincial industrial areas like the mining areas and engineering areas from outside Budapest, came and attacked them furiously for having sold out, as they put it, the general strike and so on. And the debate continued. On the 21st of November, which was after workers learned about Imre Nagy being abducted by the KGB, the delegates of the Central Workers' Council, which was now meeting in more or less permanent session, approved a manifesto, which you'll find a copy of in the other handout, and issued a further call for a general strike. And again, this general strike was enormously successful. The period 22nd, 23rd of November, there's a universal general strike across the whole of Hungary. Trucks are sent out by the workers' councils to rural areas to collect food from the peasants, which is brought back into Budapest to feed the workers. This, in other words, the production and distribution system, even, they've got some element of control over. On the 6th of December, the leaders of the workers' councils at a number of major plants were arrested by the government. And in response to this, on the 11th and the 12th of December, again, there was another general strike. But on the 11th of December, the leaders of the Central Workers' Council went again to negotiate with the government, believed they were invited to go to negotiate with the government, rather as Imre Nagy had been invited to leave the Yugoslav embassy, and they were arrested in other words, they were arrested by a trick, and martial law was then imposed in Hungary. But for several more weeks thereafter, into early 1957, there were repeated armed confrontations in different parts of Hungary, repeated strikes, and so on. Thousands of people were arrested. The Writers' Union eventually, which was supporting the workers, was closed by the government. And finally, on the 6th of January, the Workers' Council at the Sheffield Engineering Works issued the following statement. They issued the statement to its members, as it were, which you'll find down. And there must be another handout, which I haven't brought with me. Basically, what they said was, we cannot achieve what you elected us to achieve. We therefore return our mandate to the shop floor. We resign. We can't do what we were elected to do. And under those circumstances, we are handing our mandate back to the shop floor. No concessions, in other words. We can't do it, and we're not going to pretend we know. And they return. As late as March 1957, other workers' councils were still active in other workplaces, were still organising strikes and so on. And finally, it wasn't until the autumn of 1957, that the government declared that workers' councils were illegal bodies in Hungary. Now, just to conclude, you see, I think we need to draw up some sort of balance sheet of the Hungarian Revolution, because it has been a greatly misunderstood and a greatly misrepresented affair. One of the things we have to say is that from the point of view of the Hungarian working class, after 1956, their wages rose, and the government never again in Hungary dared to clamp down on the wages of Hungarian workers. And interestingly, Hungary became, after 1956, one of the most liberal of the East European countries. The revolution did make a difference to political life in Hungary, and indeed to the position of workers in Hungary. The government always, Kadar in the early 1960s, issued a slogan which said, "Those who are not against us are with us," trying to incorporate some of the forces that had been revealed in the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 into allies, as it were, of the government. Secondly, the Kremlin paid a price in terms of its credibility internationally for having put down the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. Across the world, the communist parties were seriously rocked by the event. The British Communist Party lost something like a third of its members in response to the events in Hungary. On the other hand, one has to say that the impact of the Hungarian Revolution was mitigated by two things. Firstly, by the fact, as I say at the beginning, that at the same time that the Hungarian Revolution was occurring, the British and the French and the Israelis were launching effectively an imperialist assault on Egypt, a sort of early attempt to run the Iraq war, if you like. And secondly, this was a world in which boom conditions generally were still continuing. This was not a world which was in major crisis. And the Hungarian Revolution sort of is not part of a world process in quite that. It seems a relatively isolated event. It didn't therefore have the reverberations elsewhere that it would have had if it had happened 20 years later, or 30 years later. And one result of this, I think, is that the Hungarian Revolution has been a neglected event, and an event whose pattern and meaning was distorted at the time, and it's an event which has been badly neglected since. Really, in English, there's only one significant book, I think, which has come out on the events, and that's the book by Bill Lomax, called Hungary 1956, I think, or something like that, which you'll find in the reading list, of which there's a copy in the library. Another result, though, I think, of the Hungarian events of 1956 was that they were remembered. And they were remembered elsewhere in Eastern Europe, and they had a very, the remembering of Hungary in 1956, or part of the story of Hungary in 1956, was to have a very serious effect on future events in Eastern Europe, because it was to inhibit revolutionary impulses in other countries in Eastern Europe. It cast a shadow. The Russian invasion cast a shadow over all further revolts, whether in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, and above all, I think, in 1980 to 1981 in Poland. There was a concern amongst those who led the Solidarity Union in Poland not to go too far so as to avoid provoking a Russian invasion. If there's a lesson, perhaps, of the 1956 events, it is that if it was to succeed, a revolution in an East European country would need to spread. You see, one of the things that weakened the position of the Hungarian Revolution was that the Polish left settled with Gomulka and, in a sense, left Hungary isolated. If the Polish events had continued to boil on, after all, they came to their climax only 2 days before the Hungarian Revolution began. If, in fact, the left in the Polish Communist Party and elsewhere had not been so ready to come to an agreement with Gomulka in a situation in which Poland was still boiling, in a sense, with very popular possibilities, then the outcome might have been a little different in Hungary. But certainly on its own, it couldn't win. And it's interesting that when finally Eastern Europe went, as it were, it all went. It was an international. In 1989, it was a series of events which flow across borders at an incredible speed, and it probably couldn't have gone in the end in any other way. Anyway, we'll talk about this in a seminar in a week or two, and that's it.